On March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar walked into the Roman Senate knowing he would die. This isn't the story you were taught in school. Everyone knows about the 23 stab wounds, the et tu, brute moment that Shakespeare made immortal. But the real reason Caesar died has been buried for 2,000 years. He wasn't killed for being a tyrant. He was killed because he discovered the greatest financial conspiracy in Roman history, and he was about to expose it all. Chapter 1. The Discovery. On the night of March 14th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar sat alone in his study, examining a collection of wax tablets that would seal his fate. The tablets contained financial records from the Temple of Mars, and what they revealed was a systematic theft so vast that even Caesar, who had witnessed the plunder of nations, found it difficult to comprehend. Outside his window, Rome slept peacefully, its citizens unaware that their leader had just uncovered evidence that would implicate half the Senate in the greatest corruption scheme in Roman history. The investigation had begun 3 months earlier, with what appeared to be minor accounting errors in Rome's treasury. A few missing talents here, some inconsistent ledgers there, small discrepancies that Caesar's accountants initially dismissed as clerical mistakes. But Caesar had not conquered Gaul by ignoring details. As he pressed his investigators to dig deeper, the errors began to form a pattern, and the pattern revealed a conspiracy that reached into every corner of the Roman government. For over a decade, while Caesar had been away, expanding Rome's borders and fighting civil wars, a cabal of senators had been systematically draining the Republic's wealth through an ingenious scheme. They had created phantom legions, entire military units that existed only on parchment but drew full pay and supplies from the treasury. The 7th Syrian Legion, supposedly stationed in Damascus, had been receiving payments for 8 years. According to the records Caesar now held, this non-existent force had cost Rome 12 million sesterces. Senator Cassius, who oversaw Syrian affairs, had personally authorised every payment. The scheme extended far beyond Syria. In Macedonia, Marcus Brutus had authorised payments to the 3rd and 5th Macedonian reserves, phantom units that had supposedly been guarding the northern borders for 6 years, at a cost of 18 million sesterces. Caesar's investigators had searched for these legions, visiting every fort and garrison in Macedonia. They found no trace of them, no camps, no commanders, no veterans who claimed to have served in these units. The only evidence of their existence was in the treasury records showing the steady drain of gold from Rome's coffers. Caesar's investigation revealed that at least 15 phantom legions had been created across the empire, from Britain to Egypt. Each ghost unit had been carefully documented, with false recruitment records, fabricated supply requisitions, and fictional battle reports. The conspirators had even created fake casualties, reporting deaths and injuries from skirmishes that never happened, collecting death benefits for soldiers who had never existed. The level of detail was staggering, a bureaucratic masterpiece of deception that had fooled Rome's financial overseers for years. But the phantom legions were merely one tentacle of a much larger monster. The senators had also been manipulating Rome's grain supply, the lifeblood of the city. They would delay shipments from Egypt and North Africa, creating artificial shortages that sent prices soaring. Then, at the peak of the crisis, they would release grain from secret stockpiles they had accumulated, selling it at enormous profits. The people of Rome had suffered through 3 major food shortages in the past decade, each one carefully orchestrated by the very men who stood in the Senate denouncing the crisis and calling for action. The corruption went deeper still. Caesar discovered that several senators had been selling military intelligence to Rome's enemies. Battle plans, troop movements, supply routes, all had been traded for gold. During Caesar's campaign in Gaul, Vercingetorix had somehow always seemed to know where the Roman legions would strike next. Caesar had attributed it to skilled scouts and spies, but now he knew the truth. Senator Casca had been selling information to the Gallic chieftains, prolonging a war that cost thousands of Roman lives. Even more disturbing was the discovery that during the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, several senators had been funding both sides. They had provided loans to both armies, sold supplies to both camps, and positioned themselves to profit regardless of who emerged victorious. They had turned Rome's greatest crisis into a business opportunity, treating the blood of citizens as a commodity to be traded. Caesar calculated that over 300 million sesterces had been stolen through these various schemes. This was wealth beyond imagination, enough to fund the entire Roman military for years, enough to build monuments and infrastructure that would last millennia, enough to transform Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble. Instead, this fortune had disappeared into the private vaults of a few dozen men who viewed the Republic not as a sacred trust but as a business to be exploited. The names on Caesar's list read like a roll call of the Roman aristocracy. Cassius and Brutus were the ringleaders, but they were joined by Casca, Tullius Cimber, Decimus Brutus, and dozens of others. Many were men Caesar had considered allies, men he had promoted and protected. Brutus in particular was a painful discovery. Caesar had treated him almost as a son, had forgiven his massive debts of 48 million sesterces, had given him prestigious appointments, despite his support for Pompey in the civil war. Now Caesar understood that those debts had been incurred not through misfortune, but through financing this vast criminal enterprise. Caesar had spent the previous week preparing a comprehensive audit to present to the Senate. Every fraudulent transaction had been documented, every phantom legion detailed, every stolen sesterce accounted for. He planned to read the entire report into the official record during the next day's Senate meeting, ensuring that the truth would be preserved for history. He had also prepared arrest warrants for the primary conspirators, though he knew that actually prosecuting members of the Senate would trigger a political crisis that might tear Rome apart. Unknown to Caesar, his investigation had not gone unnoticed. The conspirators had spies in Caesar's household who had been reporting on his activities. As Caesar compiled his evidence, the guilty senators had been meeting in secret, desperately searching for a way to stop him. They had considered bribing him, but Caesar's wealth made him immune to such temptation. They had considered fleeing Rome, but that would be admission of guilt and would mean abandoning everything they had built. Finally, they had reached the only conclusion possible. Caesar had to die before he could speak. Chapter 2. The Assassination. The morning of March 15th dawned grey and overcast, with strange omens that would later be remembered as warnings from the gods. Caesar had slept poorly, disturbed by dreams of drowning in blood. His wife Calpurnia had experienced even more vivid nightmares, seeing Caesar's statue pouring crimson from 100 wounds, while Romans bathed their hands in the flow. The sacred chickens refused to eat, always a troubling sign, and the soothsayer, Spurina, reminded Caesar of his earlier warning about the Ides of March. Despite these portents, Caesar prepared for the Senate meeting with grim determination. He knew the danger he faced, understood that exposing such massive corruption would make him enemies among the most powerful men in Rome. But he also believed that the Senate, for all its flaws, still retained enough honour to respect the sanctity of law and evidence. He believed that even corrupt men would not dare to commit violence in the Senate house itself, the sacred heart of the Republic. Caesar had taken precautions, though perhaps not enough. He had made copies of all his evidence, storing them in a secret location known only to his most trusted freedmen. He had written a detailed letter to Mark Antony, explaining everything he had discovered, with instructions for it to be opened if Caesar failed to return from the Senate. He had even considered bringing his Spanish bodyguard to the meeting, but ultimately decided against it, not wanting to appear as a tyrant afraid of his own senators. The conspirators had spent the night finalising their plan. 23 senators had committed to the assassination, each agreeing to strike a blow to share the guilt and make it impossible for any single man to be held responsible. They would surround Caesar on the pretense of presenting a petition, then attack simultaneously. After the deed was done, they would immediately address the Senate and the people, claiming they had saved the Republic from a would-be king. The narrative was crucial. Caesar the tyrant, not Caesar the investigator, had to be the story Rome remembered. They had also made plans to destroy all of Caesar's evidence. Brutus had arranged for men to break into Caesar's study the moment news of the assassination reached them. Every tablet, every scroll, every piece of parchment related to the investigation would be burned. They would claim it was to prevent civil war, to stop Caesar's supporters from using his papers to justify revenge. The Roman people, shocked by the assassination and fearful of chaos, would accept this explanation without question. As Caesar made his way to the Senate, he received multiple warnings. A Greek philosopher named Artemidorus had discovered the plot and tried to hand Caesar a scroll revealing everything. But Caesar, surrounded by petitioners, set it aside to read later. Spurinna, the soothsayer, appeared again, and Caesar famously told him that the Ides of March had come without harm, to which Spurinna replied that they had come but not yet passed. Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal supporter and co-consul, had also heard rumours of danger. He tried to intercept Caesar before the meeting, but the conspirators had anticipated this. Trebonius, one of the plotters, engaged Antony in conversation outside the Senate house, physically preventing him from entering. Antony was strong and capable of violence. His presence during the assassination could have changed everything. Inside the Senate house, the conspirators waited nervously. Some were having second thoughts, understanding that they were about to commit an act that would echo through history. But Cassius and Brutus held them firm, reminding them of what Caesar's audit would mean for their futures: prison, exile, poverty, disgrace for their families for generations. They had passed the point of no return when they stole their first sesterce. Now they had to see it through to the end. When Caesar entered, the Senate rose in respect. He walked to his golden chair, the honour granted him by the same body that was about to destroy him. Tullius Cimber approached first, pretending to petition for his brother's recall from exile. As Caesar tried to wave him away, Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga, the signal for the attack to begin. Casca struck first, his dagger catching Caesar in the shoulder. Caesar fought back initially, using his stylus as a weapon, showing the strength and determination that had conquered Gaul. But as more senators pressed in, as daggers found their mark again and again, Caesar understood that this was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a coordinated execution. When he saw Brutus among the assassins, Brutus whom he had loved and protected, something broke inside him. He pulled his toga over his head in the traditional gesture of accepting death and fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling on the Senate floor. 23 wounds marked Caesar's body, though physicians would later determine that only one, a thrust to the heart, had been fatal. The conspirators stood over the corpse, their togae splattered with blood, their daggers still dripping. For a moment nobody moved. Then panic seized the Senate. Senators who had not been part of the conspiracy fled in terror, spreading word of the assassination through Rome like wildfire. The conspirators had prepared speeches about tyranny and liberty, about saving the Republic from a would-be king. But in the chaos that followed the assassination, their carefully crafted narrative began to fall apart. The Roman people, rather than celebrating their supposed liberation, were horrified. Caesar had been beloved by the common citizens, who cared little for the Senate's pretensions about republican virtue, but cared greatly about the land grants, grain distributions, and public works that Caesar had provided. While Brutus and Cassius tried to control the narrative in the forum, their agents were ransacking Caesar's study. They found his investigation records, exactly where their spies had reported, stacks of tablets and scrolls documenting years of systematic theft. Into the flames they went, the evidence of the greatest corruption scandal in Roman history reduced to ash and smoke. They also found Caesar's will, which they allowed to survive, knowing it would distract attention from their crimes. But the conspirators had made a fatal error. They had not found the copies Caesar had hidden, nor had they intercepted the letter to Mark Antony. 3 days after the assassination, as Rome still reeled from the shock, Antony received Caesar's message from beyond the grave. In it, Caesar detailed everything he had discovered about the phantom legions, the grain manipulation, the selling of military intelligence. He provided the location of the duplicate records and instructed Antony to use them wisely. Antony faced an impossible choice. He could expose the truth and likely trigger a civil war that would destroy the Republic entirely, or he could use the information as leverage, keeping the evidence secret while positioning himself as Caesar's heir and avenger. He chose the latter path, understanding that sometimes the truth is too dangerous to reveal, that sometimes a noble lie serves better than an ugly fact. Chapter 3. The Unravelling. 3 days after Caesar's assassination, Rome existed in a state of suspended chaos, like a pot of water just before it boils. The conspirators had expected celebration, imagined themselves carried through the streets as liberators, but instead they found themselves barricaded in their homes, while angry mobs roamed the city demanding justice. The forum, usually filled with merchants and citizens conducting business, had become a battlefield of competing narratives where truth and lies mixed so thoroughly that even the speakers could no longer distinguish between them. Mark Antony moved through this chaos like a shark through bloodied water, patient and calculating. The duplicate records Caesar had hidden were now in his possession, stored in a vault beneath the Temple of Vesta, where even the conspirators would not dare to trespass. He spent hours studying them, memorizing every detail of the phantom legions, every fraudulent transaction, every piece of evidence that could destroy the men who had murdered his friend and mentor. But Antony understood something the conspirators had failed to grasp. In politics, information is most powerful when it remains a threat rather than a revelation. The reading of Caesar's will changed everything. When the Roman people learned that Caesar had left 75 sesterces to every citizen and his gardens to the public, the simmering anger exploded into rage. Here was proof that Caesar had been no tyrant hoarding wealth for himself, but a benefactor who had loved Rome's common people, even in death. The conspirators' narrative crumbled further when Antony revealed Caesar's planned public works, the libraries and forums and aqueducts that would have transformed Rome. All now impossible because the Senate's supposed defenders of liberty had driven daggers into the man who would have built them. Brutus attempted to salvage the situation with a speech in the forum explaining that Caesar had been ambitious, that his death was necessary to preserve the Republic. The crowd listened respectfully, their silence more damning than any outcry. When Antony took the rostrum afterward, he carried with him not the evidence of financial corruption, but something far more powerful. Caesar's blood-stained toga, pierced with 23 holes. He spoke of each wound, named each senator who had struck, transformed each thrust of the dagger into a betrayal not just of Caesar, but of every Roman citizen who had benefited from his generosity. Behind closed doors, The conspirators were beginning to fracture. Some wanted to flee Rome immediately, sensing that public opinion had turned irrevocably against them. Others, particularly Cassius, argued for standing firm, insisting that time would vindicate their actions. But the real terror came when Antony began dropping subtle hints in his public speeches, mentioning phantom legions as metaphors, referring to grain shortages with knowing looks, using phrases that made the conspirators' blood run cold because they recognized their own crimes being outlined without being explicitly stated. Decimus Brutus was the first to break. The pressure of knowing that Antony possessed evidence of his theft drove him to paranoia. He began seeing spies everywhere, convinced that every servant, every slave, every associate was reporting to Antony. He started burning documents obsessively, destroying even legitimate papers in his terror that they might somehow incriminate him. When he appeared in public, which became increasingly rare, sweat poured from his face and his hands shook so badly he could barely hold a cup of wine. The conspirators met secretly in the house of Cassius to discuss their options. The meeting was a disaster of mutual recrimination and barely controlled panic. Casca accused Brutus of failing to properly search Caesar's properties for duplicate records. Brutus blamed Cassius for underestimating Antony's cunning. Tilius Cimber suggested they should assassinate Antony as well, but others pointed out that killing another consul would transform them from tyrannicides into simple murderers in the public eye. The alliance that had united them in conspiracy was dissolving in the acid of fear and suspicion. Meanwhile, Antony was careful orchestrating a propaganda campaign that would have impressed Caesar himself. He arranged for veterans of Caesar's legions to march through Rome, not in military formation, but as grieving citizens, telling stories of Caesar's generosity, his forgiveness of enemies, his vision for Rome's future. He had Caesar's planned reforms read in the Forum: debt relief for the poor, land distribution for veterans, citizenship extensions for allied communities. Each announcement deepened the public sense of loss and strengthened their anger toward the assassins. The Senate itself was paralysed. Many senators who had not participated in the assassination but had benefited from the corruption schemes were terrified of being exposed. They knew Antony had something, could see it in the way he looked at them during sessions, the slight smile when he mentioned fiscal responsibility or military accounting. They began approaching him privately, offering support, money, anything to keep their names out of whatever revelations might come. Antony played them masterfully, neither confirming nor denying what he knew, accepting their allegiance while keeping them in constant fear. He understood that the entire Roman system was built on corruption to some degree, that exposing everything would not cleanse the Republic but destroy it. Instead, he would use the information to reshape Rome according to his own vision, with himself at the centre of power. Young Octavian's arrival in Rome added another layer of complexity. Caesar's 18-year-old heir came seeking his inheritance and revenge for his great-uncle's death. Antony initially dismissed him as a boy playing at politics, but Octavian proved surprisingly astute. He began gathering his own information about the assassination, interviewing witnesses, collecting testimonies, building a case that focused not on financial corruption, but on the simple brutality of the murder. The two men circled each other warily, both claiming to be Caesar's true heir, both seeking to control the narrative of his death. Antony had the evidence of corruption, Octavian had the name and the legal inheritance. Neither trusted the other, but both recognised that the conspirators were their common enemy. An uneasy alliance formed, temporary and fragile, but powerful enough to doom the assassins. Brutus and Cassius finally understood that remaining in Rome meant death, either by mob violence or judicial execution. They fled the city, claiming they were taking up their provincial commands, but everyone knew they were running for their lives. Their departure was seen as an admission of guilt, the final collapse of their pretense that they had acted for noble reasons. Other conspirators followed, scattering across the empire like roaches when a lamp is lit. Chapter 4. The Cover-Up. The systematic elimination of evidence began even before the conspirators fled Rome. Teams of men, their faces covered and their loyalties bought with gold that had once filled Phantom Legion's payrolls, swept through the city in coordinated raids. They targeted the homes of minor officials who might have kept copies of suspicious documents, the offices of clerks who had processed fraudulent payments, even the workshops of scribes who might have duplicated sensitive materials. Fires broke out with suspicious frequency in buildings that housed financial records. The Temple of Saturn, repository of the state treasury's archives, suffered a devastating blaze that destroyed 10 years of documentation. Antony watched these desperate attempts at cover-up with amusement. The conspirators were burning evidence of crimes he already had documented, destroying records that Caesar's thorough investigation had already copied and preserved. But he let them continue their arson and theft, understanding that their panic-driven destruction only made them appear more guilty to the Roman public. Every fire, every raid, every mysterious disappearance of documents added to the growing certainty that Caesar had been killed not for his ambition, but for what he had discovered. The corruption network extended far beyond the original conspirators. Hundreds of minor officials, clerks and administrators had participated in or profited from the schemes. These men now lived in terror, not knowing whether their involvement had been documented in Caesar's investigation. Some fled Rome entirely, abandoning positions they'd held for decades. Others stayed and tried to ingratiate themselves with Antony, offering information about their former associates in exchange for protection. One such informant was Lucius Vorenus, a military quartermaster who had processed payments for 3 of the Phantom Legions. Trembling with fear, he approached Antony with detailed information about how the scheme had operated. He explained how false musters were created, how supply requisitions were forged, how the money was laundered through legitimate merchant houses before disappearing into senators' private accounts. His testimony, combined with Caesar's records, provided Antony with an even more complete picture of the conspiracy. But Antony faced a delicate problem. If he revealed everything, the scandal would destroy not just the conspirators, but the entire Roman financial system. Citizens would lose faith in their government. Soldiers would question whether their pay would continue. Allies would doubt Rome's ability to honour treaties and trade agreements. The Republic, already weakened by civil war and assassination, might not survive such a complete loss of credibility. Instead, Antony chose a more subtle approach. He began implementing reforms that quietly addressed the corruption without explicitly acknowledging it. New accounting procedures were introduced for military payments, requiring multiple signatures and regular audits. The grain supply system was restructured with oversight mechanisms that made large-scale manipulation nearly impossible. Military intelligence was compartmentalized so that no single senator could sell comprehensive information to enemies. These reforms were presented as modernizations, improvements that any efficient government would implement. Only the conspirators and their accomplices understood them as what they really were: bars on a cage that prevented them from repeating their crimes. Every new regulation was a reminder that Antony knew everything and could destroy them whenever he chose. The propaganda war continued with increasing sophistication. Antony commissioned plays and poems that portrayed Caesar as a martyred reformer, subtly hinting at the corruption he had been fighting without providing specifics. One particularly popular drama featured a fictional Roman general who discovered that his enemies were stealing from the treasury to fund their opposition to him. Audiences drew their own conclusions about the parallels to recent events. Octavian, not to be outdone, funded his own propaganda campaign. His writers focused on the personal betrayal of the assassination, particularly Brutus's role. The story of Brutus being Caesar's illegitimate son began to circulate, making his participation in the murder not just treachery, but patricide. Whether true or not, the narrative was devastatingly effective in turning public opinion even more strongly against the conspirators. The Senate, populated by men who were either guilty of corruption or terrified of being accused of it, became Antony's puppet. Any legislation he proposed passed without debate. Any investigation he suggested was immediately approved. The few senators who tried to oppose him found their own financial dealings suddenly under scrutiny. Anonymous tips leading investigators to irregularities in their accounts that may or may not have been real, but were certainly inconvenient. The exiled conspirators attempted to fight back from their scattered refugees. They sent letters to Rome claiming that Antony had forged evidence against them, that he was using Caesar's death to seize power for himself. Some of these letters contained grains of truth. Antony was certainly consolidating power, but their credibility was so damaged that even accurate accusations were dismissed as desperate lies from guilty men. Brutus, from his exile in Athens, wrote philosophical treatises defending his actions, arguing that killing a tyrant was not just permissible, but obligatory for a true republican. These works might have been more convincing if Antony hadn't simultaneously been releasing selected excerpts from Caesar's investigation, carefully chosen details about phantom legions and stolen funds that made Brutus's high-minded rhetoric seem like a transparent attempt to hide common theft. The cover-up extended to the historical record itself. Scribes and historians were pressured to omit certain details from their accounts. The official Senate records of the months before the assassination were edited, removing references to Caesar's investigation and the financial audits he had ordered. Even private letters were not safe. Antony's agents intercepted correspondence that might contain damaging information, destroying or altering documents that didn't fit the approved narrative. Some of the most damaging evidence simply vanished. A Greek merchant named Demetrius, who had kept detailed records of suspicious grain transactions involving several senators, disappeared along with his entire family and all his business documents. A former military tribune who had questioned the existence of a phantom legion was found dead in the Tiber, apparently drowned, though the bruises on his throat suggested otherwise. These incidents were never officially connected to the conspiracy, but the message was clear. Some truths were too dangerous to survive. As months passed, the cover-up became self-perpetuating. Those who knew the truth had too much to lose by revealing it. Antony had his power, Octavian had his inheritance, the corrupt senators had their freedom, and the Roman people had their grief and anger focused on the assassins, rather than the system that had created them. The fiction that Caesar had been killed solely for his ambition became easier to maintain than the complex truth of financial conspiracy and systematic corruption. The physical evidence of the conspiracy was gradually destroyed or hidden away. The fraudulent military records were burned. The grain manipulation documents were eliminated. The testimonies of witnesses were suppressed or discredited. Within a year of Caesar's death, it would have been nearly impossible for an outsider to piece together the full scope of the corruption that had triggered the assassination. Yet Antony kept Caesar's original investigation documents, the complete record of the conspiracy that had cost Caesar his life. He stored them in a secret location, understanding their value not just as historical evidence, but as an insurance policy. As long as he possessed them, the surviving conspirators and their accomplices would fear him. As long as they feared him, he could shape Rome's future according to his will. The Battle of Philippi, where Antony and Octavian would eventually defeat Brutus and Cassius, was still in the future. But the true battle, the one for control of the narrative, was already won. The story of Caesar's assassination had been written, edited, and approved. He had died for being ambitious, for threatening the Republic, for aspiring to kingship. The truth that he had died for discovering the greatest financial conspiracy in Roman history was buried deeper than any tomb. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The plains of Philippi stretched beneath an October sky the colour of old blood, where two armies faced each other across a divide that represented more than military opposition. On one side stood the forces of Antony and Octavian, carriers of Caesar's legacy and guardians of his secrets. On the other waited the armies of Brutus and Cassius, the last desperate stand of men who had killed to keep their crimes hidden and now would die for the same reason. The soldiers on both sides believed they were fighting for the soul of Rome, but the true battle was over which version of history would survive. Brutus had spent the 2 years since Caesar's assassination constructing elaborate justifications for his actions. In Athens and later in Asia Minor, he had gathered supporters by presenting himself as the defender of republican virtue against tyranny. His speeches were masterworks of rhetoric that never mentioned phantom legions or stolen grain, focusing instead on abstract principles of liberty and the danger of one-man rule. Those who heard him could almost believe that he had acted from pure philosophical conviction, that the dagger he had driven into Caesar had been wielded by principle rather than panic. Cassius had taken a different approach, where Brutus sought to elevate the assassination into noble tyrannicide. Cassius worked to muddy the waters so thoroughly that truth became indistinguishable from fiction. He spread dozens of different stories about Caesar's death, each contradicting the others, creating a maze of narratives in which the real conspiracy could hide. According to his agents, Caesar had been killed by jealous lovers, by foreign agents, by religious fanatics, by anyone except senators protecting their financial crimes. But Antony had been busy as well. Using the intelligence network Caesar had built and expanded with his own additions, he had tracked down witnesses, gathered additional evidence, and compiled dossiers on every conspirator and their associates. He knew which merchants had helped launder the Phantom Legion funds, which bankers had facilitated the grain speculation, which foreign contacts had purchased Roman military intelligence. This information gave him leverage not just over the conspirators, but over half the Roman elite. The night before the first battle at Philippi, something extraordinary occurred. A messenger arrived at Brutus's tent, carrying a sealed package from Antony. Inside was a single document, a copy of Caesar's original investigation notes, specifically the pages dealing with Brutus's involvement in the conspiracy. Attached was a brief note in Antony's hand. "Your soldiers deserve to know what they're really dying for." Brutus burned the documents immediately, but the damage was done. He spent the night in tortured contemplation, knowing that Antony could destroy his reputation at any moment, that every noble word he had spoken about republican virtue could be exposed as a desperate criminal's lie. The philosophical certainty that had sustained him crumbled, replaced by the terrible understanding that he was not a hero of the Republic, but simply a thief who had murdered the man who had caught him stealing. The battle itself was a confusion of dust and blood and screaming men, but its outcome was never truly in doubt. Brutus's forces fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant not just death, but disgrace. Cassius's legions showed more discipline, but when false reports convinced Cassius that Brutus had been defeated, he fell on his sword rather than face capture. His death was quick, but in his final moments he was heard to mutter about phantom legions, a delirious confession that his terrified servants would later report to Antony. Brutus held out for 20 more days, his situation growing more hopeless with each passing hour. Desertions increased as rumours spread through his camp about the real reasons for Caesar's assassination. Some of these rumours were planted by Antony's agents, but others arose spontaneously from soldiers who had begun to piece together fragments of overheard conversations and suspicious orders. An army that had marched under the banner of liberty began to suspect it was fighting for criminals. The second battle at Philippi was less a military engagement than a mass surrender. Entire units of Brutus's army switched sides or simply walked away, unwilling to die for a cause they no longer believed in. Brutus retreated with a small group of loyal followers, but even they began to waver when Antony's forces circulated copies of financial documents showing how their leaders had enriched themselves while common soldiers went unpaid. On his last night alive, Brutus sat by a dying fire and dictated a final letter to the Roman people. In it, he attempted one last time to justify his actions, to paint himself as a defender of republican values. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. The letter was never completed. As dawn approached and Antony's forces closed in, Brutus asked his slave Strato to hold his sword while he ran upon it. His last words, according to witnesses, were not about liberty or the Republic, but a bitter acknowledgement. Caesar, be satisfied. With the principal conspirators dead, Antony faced a crucial decision. He possessed enough evidence to expose the entire corruption network, to reveal how deeply the rot had spread through Roman society. But doing so would have required implicating many of the same senators and officials he now needed to govern the empire. Instead, he chose a selective revelation, exposing enough to justify the proscriptions that followed, but keeping the full scope of the conspiracy secret. The proscription lists were presented as targeting enemies of the state who had supported the assassins. In reality, they were carefully curated to eliminate those who knew too much about the financial crimes, while sparing others who could be useful to the new regime. Men died not for their political positions, but for their knowledge of phantom legions and manipulated grain supplies. Others survived by pledging absolute loyalty to Antony and Octavian, their silence purchased with their lives. Octavian, who would later become Augustus, proved even more ruthless in controlling the narrative. He understood that the power of the information lay not in its revelation, but in its possession. While Antony used the evidence as a club to beat opponents into submission, Octavian wielded it like a surgeon's knife, precisely eliminating threats while preserving the illusion of republican restoration. The official history commissioned by the victors mentioned nothing of financial conspiracy. In their version, Caesar had been murdered by men who feared his ambition and resented his success. Brutus and Cassius were portrayed as misguided idealists at best, jealous and bitter men at worst. The complex web of corruption that had actually triggered the assassination was reduced to simple political rivalry and personal animosity. Yet the truth could not be entirely suppressed. Veterans who had served in real legions whispered about units that existed only on paper. Grain merchants told stories of shipments that had disappeared into senators' warehouses. Foreign traders spoke of Roman military secrets that had been surprisingly easy to purchase in the years before Caesar's death. These fragments of truth persisted like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. Chapter 6. History's Verdict. 20 years after Caesar's death, Rome had transformed into an empire in all but name, ruled by Augustus with an authority that would have seemed impossible under the Republic. The young man who had arrived in Rome as Octavian, seeking vengeance for his great-uncle's murder, had become the most powerful individual in Roman history. In his private study, secured by guards and accessible only to his most trusted servants, he kept a collection of documents that told the true story of Caesar's assassination. Augustus had inherited these papers from Antony after defeating him at Actium, adding them to his own extensive collection of evidence about the conspiracy. He spent long nights reading through them, understanding with increasing clarity how the corruption had worked and, more importantly, how to prevent it from happening again. The administrative reforms he implemented, the creation of permanent bureaucracies, the establishment of regular audits and inspections, all stemmed from lessons learned from Caesar's fatal investigation. The phantom legions had been eliminated through a comprehensive military census that required every soldier to appear in person for payment. The grain supply system had been completely restructured under imperial control, making large-scale manipulation impossible. The sale of military intelligence had been curtailed through a combination of harsh penalties and better pay for those with access to sensitive information. Augustus had quietly fixed the problems that had led to Caesar's death without ever publicly acknowledging they had existed, but the human cost of keeping the secret was substantial. Hundreds of people who knew fragments of the truth had died over the years, some in battles, others in mysterious accidents, many in the proscriptions that followed Philippi. Entire families had been eliminated to ensure that no hereditary knowledge of the conspiracy survived. The Greek merchant Demetrius's disappearance had been just the beginning of a systematic erasure of witnesses. Among the documents Augustus preserved was a letter Caesar had written but never sent, apparently intended for Brutus. In it, Caesar laid out everything he knew about Brutus's involvement in the Phantom Legions, but rather than threatening exposure, he offered forgiveness and a chance for redemption. Caesar had planned to reform the system from within, to give the corrupt senators an opportunity to make amends without destroying them. The letter revealed Caesar's fatal flaw. He had believed that showing mercy to criminals would inspire gratitude rather than desperation. Augustus learned from this mistake. He showed no mercy to those who knew the truth and couldn't be trusted with it. A former clerk who had processed Phantom Legion payments was found dead in his bed, apparently of natural causes, though the timing was suspicious. A retired military tribune, who had questioned discrepancies in troop numbers, fell from a cliff while walking alone. These deaths were never investigated, the silence of the authorities more eloquent than any confession. The poets and historians of Augustus's age knew better than to probe too deeply into the events surrounding Caesar's assassination. Virgil's Aeneid mentioned the assassination only obliquely, focusing on the divine justice that punished the conspirators rather than their motivations. Livy's history of Rome grew mysteriously vague when discussing the financial administration of the late Republic. Even Ovid, before his exile, had learned to avoid certain topics after a poem that hinted at senatorial corruption earned him a private warning from Augustus himself. Yet Augustus also understood that completely suppressing the truth would only make it more powerful. Instead, he allowed controlled versions of the story to circulate, narratives that contained enough fact to seem credible but omitted the most damaging revelations. Yes, there had been some financial irregularities in the Senate. Yes, Caesar had been investigating certain administrative problems. But these were presented as minor issues, footnotes to the grand political drama of the assassination, rather than its primary cause. The conspirators' descendants were handled with particular care. Some were allowed to prosper, their family names rehabilitated in exchange for absolute loyalty and silence. Others were quietly marginalised, their wealth confiscated through legal pretexts, their influence eliminated without explicit acknowledgement of their ancestors' crimes. The son of Decimus Brutus disappeared while travelling to take up a minor provincial post. The grandson of Cassius died in a plague that seemed to target only his household. Marcus Brutus's philosophical works were preserved but edited. Passages that might be interpreted as references to financial crimes were altered or removed. His defence of tyrannicide was allowed to stand, even promoted, because it supported the narrative that the assassination had been about political philosophy rather than criminal conspiracy. Future generations would read Brutus's words and see a misguided idealist, not a desperate thief. The physical evidence of the conspiracy was gradually destroyed. The duplicate records Caesar had hidden were burned after Augustus had memorized their contents. The testimonies of witnesses were eliminated once they had served their purpose. Even the financial documents that had been used to track the phantom legions were disposed of, their ashes scattered in the Tiber. By the time of Augustus's death, no physical proof of the conspiracy remained except for the small collection in his private study. Augustus designated no heir for these documents. His will contained no mention of them, no instructions for their disposition. When he died, his wife Livia found them and, understanding their significance, made the only decision that could protect her son Tiberius's succession. She burned them all. The last physical evidence of the true reason for Caesar's assassination turned to smoke and ash, joining the countless other documents that had been destroyed to protect the secret. But truth has a way of surviving even the most thorough attempts at suppression. Decades later, an aged Egyptian scribe who had worked in Alexandria's great library told his apprentice about strange documents he had seen, copies of Roman military records that didn't match the official histories. A retired centurion, deep in his cups, spoke of serving in a legion that had supposedly been stationed in Gaul but had never left Italy. A Jewish merchant mentioned Roman grain shipments that had arrived in Jerusalem with Senate seals but no official documentation. These stories were dismissed as confusion, lies, or misunderstandings. The official history was clear. Caesar had been assassinated because he threatened the Republic with his ambition. Brutus and Cassius had acted from principle, even if that principle had been misguided. The financial irregularities that some claimed had existed were either exaggerations or fabrications, certainly not significant enough to trigger the murder of Rome's greatest general. 2,000 years would pass. Historians would debate Caesar's assassination endlessly, analysing political motivations, personal relationships, philosophical principles. They would write countless books about the death of the Republic and the birth of the Empire, about the tragedy of Brutus and the triumph of Augustus. But they would never know about the phantom legions, the stolen grain, the sold intelligence. They would never understand that Caesar had died not for reaching too high, but for looking too closely. The conspiracy had succeeded in one crucial respect. It had hidden itself so thoroughly that it vanished from history. The senators who had created phantom legions, who had stolen from Rome's treasury, who had sold military secrets to enemies, achieved in death what they had failed to accomplish in life. Their crimes were erased, leaving only the noble lie that they had acted from political conviction rather than criminal desperation. In the end, perhaps that was Caesar's true tragedy. He had been murdered not by defenders of the Republic, but by its parasites, not by idealists, but by thieves. His death had been transformed into a symbol of political ambition, punished, when in reality it had been justice denied. The corruption he had tried to expose had not only survived his death, but had used that death to protect itself, wrapping itself in the rhetoric of liberty and principle, until the truth became indistinguishable from the lie. The last word belonged to Augustus. Near the end of his life, he was asked by a young senator why Caesar had been assassinated. Augustus looked at the young man for a long moment, perhaps remembering the documents he'd read, the secrets he had kept, the people who had died to maintain the fiction. Then he gave the only answer that history would remember, because he was ambitious. The senator accepted this explanation and repeated it to others. It became part of the historical record, the accepted truth that would echo through centuries. No one noticed the bitter smile on Augustus's face as he spoke, or the way his fingers traced patterns on his desk as if writing words that could never be spoken aloud. Phantom legions, stolen grain, murdered truth. History's verdict had been rendered. Caesar had died for ambition. The conspiracy had never existed. The corruption had been minor, if it had occurred at all. The Republic had fallen because of grand political forces, not petty financial crimes. This was the story that would be taught, studied, and believed. The truth died with Augustus, cremated with the documents, Livia burned, scattered like ashes on the wind. All that remained were fragments, hints, suggestions that something more had happened, pieces of a puzzle that could never be fully assembled because too many pieces had been deliberately destroyed. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all, that Caesar's assassination, one of history's most significant events, would be remembered for reasons that were entirely false, its true cause buried beneath layers of lies so deep that even time itself could not excavate them. The conspirators had lost their lives, but they had won the war for history's memory. Their greatest crime was not murdering Caesar, but ensuring that no one would ever know why they had really done it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of history, where truth and fiction intertwine in the corridors of ancient Rome. If you enjoyed exploring this alternative perspective on Caesar's assassination, where corruption, not ambition, sealed his fate, I invite you to subscribe. From the phantom legions that existed only on paper to the conspiracies that succeeded precisely because they erased themselves from memory, we've explored the spaces between documented facts and the suspicious silences in historical records. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, may your dreams be filled with the whispers of untold stories and the echoes of forgotten truths. Good night, and remember, sometimes the most powerful conspiracies are the ones that convinced us they never existed at all.